Doctors were preparing to euthanize the young boy when something extraordinary happened. A horse defied all expectations. The autumn evening settled over the countryside like a quilt, stitched together with amber and crimson. Rose leaned against the sturdy wooden fence of the stable, watching as the last rays of sunlight bathed the fields in a golden glow. Apollo stood in his stall, his dappled gray coat marked by the remnants of the day's work. At 16, he was no longer the vigorous therapy horse he had once been. His movements were slower now, his proud gait softened by age. Yet there was a wisdom in his eyes, a quiet understanding that Rose had always found comforting. Rose sighed, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. The scent of damp hay and the faint musk of horses grounded her in the moment. For over a decade, she had cared for Apollo, watching him grow from a spirited colt into a gentle giant who could coax smiles from even the most withdrawn children. Therapy work had always been his calling, and he had excelled at it. But tonight, something felt off. Apollo, usually content after a light day of exercise, paced restlessly in his stall. His hooves scraped against the wooden floor and his ears twitched as if he were listening to something Rose couldn't hear. "What's got into you, old boy?" she murmured. She stepped closer, reaching out to stroke his neck, hoping the familiar touch would calm him. But instead, Apollo flinched, a subtle movement that was enough to make Rose furrow her brow. He snorted, his breath visible in the cool evening air, and turned his head toward the stable door, nostrils flaring. Rose glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a fox or some other nocturnal creature lurking in the shadows, but the yard was empty. "Maybe it's the weather," she muttered, though the words felt hollow. She secured the latch on his stall and made her way back to the small farmhouse she called home. As she entered, the warmth of the wood-burning stove enveloped her, a sharp contrast to the chill outside. She poured herself a cup of tea, but her thoughts remained on Apollo's strange behavior. It was unlike him, and after all these years together, she trusted her instincts when it came to him. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Rose was startled awake by a sound she couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of the old farmhouse, but something sharper, more deliberate. A distant clatter. Her heart quickened as she threw on a jacket and stepped outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The stable door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Panic surged through her as she ran toward it. "Apollo!" she called, her voice slicing through the stillness. Inside his stall, he was gone. The latch she had secured hours earlier dangled loose as if it had been deliberately undone. Rose's mind raced. Apollo had never tried to escape before. He was always calm, obedient, and content with their routine. Grabbing a flashlight, she scanned the surrounding fields. Her breath formed clouds in the crisp night air, and tracks in the soft earth confirmed what she feared. Apollo had bolted. Rose climbed into her truck, the engine sputtering to life as she backed out of the driveway. The headlights swept across the fields, but there was no sign of him. She drove slowly, calling his name into the darkness, her voice laced with both fear and frustration. What could have caused him to act so out of character? Meanwhile, Apollo moved with a purpose that defied explanation. His hooves struck the ground in a steady rhythm as he followed an invisible trail. The night wrapped around him like a cloak, but he was undeterred, his instincts sharp and unwavering. He crossed fields, forded a shallow stream, and navigated the edge of a dense forest, his path illuminated only by the moonlight. It was as if something, or someone, was guiding him. Eventually, Rose spotted him near the edge of town, his silver-gray coat glowing faintly in the moonlight. Relief washed over her, only to be replaced by confusion when she realized where he was headed. The hospital loomed in the distance, its sterile white walls reflecting the moonlight. Rose's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Why would he come here? Apollo didn't stop until he reached the hospital's emergency entrance. The automatic doors swished open, and the night staff froze at the sight of a horse calmly stepping into the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. A security guard moved to intervene, but Apollo's presence was so serene, so inexplicably commanding, that no one could bring themselves to force him out. It was as if he belonged there, as though he were a natural extension of the building's purpose. Rose arrived moments later, breathless and bewildered. "Apollo, what are you doing?" she whispered, but the horse paid her no mind. Instead, he moved steadily forward, his ears swiveling as if guided by a sound only he could hear. The staff exchanged incredulous glances but didn't stop him. A nurse, her badge reading Emily Rodriguez, stepped forward. "Is this your horse?" she asked, her tone a mix of amazement and concern. "Yes, but I don't," Rose began, only to be interrupted by Apollo's determined stride. He rounded a corner and stopped in front of a large window overlooking the neonatal intensive care unit. Inside, tiny incubators housed fragile lives, each one surrounded by a tangle of tubes and monitors. Apollo lowered his head, his breath fogging the glass. Rose's confusion deepened, but before she could act, something remarkable happened. Inside the NICU, a premature baby named Thomas lay motionless in his incubator. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. The condition of baby Thomas had worsened over the past week, and the doctors were running out of options. His parents sat nearby, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. Suddenly, the steady beep of Thomas's heart monitor quickened. His oxygen levels, which had been dangerously low, began to climb. The nurses rushed to his side, their movements frantic, yet precise. From the hallway, Rose watched in stunned silence as the staff gathered around the incubator. One of the nurses glanced up, her eyes meeting Rose's. "I don't know what's happening," the nurse said, her voice trembling, "but his vitals are improving." Rose turned her gaze to Apollo, who stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the tiny figure in the incubator. There was no logical explanation for what she was witnessing, but in that moment, logic seemed irrelevant. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and Apollo, her aging, gentle therapy horse, was at the heart of it. The fluorescent lights of the hospital buzzed softly, and the stillness in the hallway settled back in. Apollo remained rooted to the spot, his presence calm yet commanding. Rose stood beside him, her breath caught somewhere between awe and confusion. Inside the NICU, the once frantic activity around baby Thomas had subsided, replaced by a hushed reverence. The monitors continued to show signs of improvement. Oxygen levels, heart rate, and blood pressure had stabilized. The tiny infant, who only hours earlier seemed to be on the brink of life, now rested more peacefully than anyone had seen in days. Rose broke the silence first, glancing at the nurse who had approached earlier. "What's happening? Why is this happening?" Her words faltered under the weight of the moment. Nurse Emily, still clutching her clipboard as though it were a lifeline, shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I've been working here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. One moment we were preparing for the worst, and now—" She gestured vaguely at the monitors. "It's like he's turned a corner." Apollo shifted slightly, the movement breaking the spell that had seemed to fall over everyone. His head remained low, his ears swiveling toward the incubator. Rose placed a hand on his neck, feeling the familiar warmth of his coat. But tonight it felt different, almost sacred. There was an intangible connection in the air, something that defied every understanding she had. She glanced at Thomas's parents, seated just beyond the window. The mother, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks, clutched her husband's hand tightly, her eyes darting between her son and the horse standing in the hallway. The father leaned forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and fragile hope. The doors to the NICU swished open, and Dr. Harper entered. Her presence was brisk and efficient, tall, with sharp features softened slightly by the lines of experience etched into her face. Her white coat swayed as she approached the nurses near Thomas's incubator. "What's the situation?" she asked, her tone clipped but not unkind. Nurse Emily stepped forward, regaining her composure under Dr. Harper's scrutiny. "Thomas's vitals began improving about 10 minutes ago," she reported, flipping through her notes. "Oxygen levels are up, heart rate is steady, and his breathing is stronger. We haven't changed his treatment in the last hour, so we're not sure what triggered the improvement." Dr. Harper frowned, narrowing her gaze at the monitors. She stepped closer to the incubator, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked the baby's lines and examined the readings. After a moment, she turned to Emily. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she said, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her confusion. "Continue monitoring closely. This could be temporary. I'll review his charts." Her words faltered when she noticed something beyond the glass. Her eyes shifted to the hallway and froze, her expression changing from clinical detachment clinical detachment to sheer incredulity. "Is that a horse?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief, as though the very question might shatter reality. Rose stepped forward hesitantly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment and the strange weight of the moment. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling. "His name is Apollo. He's my therapy horse. I don't know why he came here. He escaped his stable tonight and, well, this is where he ended up." Dr. Harper's frown deepened, not out of anger but sheer disbelief. "And no one thought to stop him?" she asked, glancing at the nurses and security guard who had gathered nearby. The security guard, a burly man whose name tag read Jim, shrugged helplessly. "We tried," he said, his deep voice tinged with amusement. "But he just walked right in like he knew where he was going." Dr. Harper pressed her lips into a thin line, her sharp eyes returning to Apollo. The horse met her gaze steadily, unflinching. There was something about his presence, something that seemed to demand respect even in the face of logic. After a long moment, she exhaled and turned back to Rose. "This is highly irregular," she said, her tone measured. "But I can't argue with results. For now, let's not disturb the baby's progress. We'll reevaluate in the morning." She turned to Nurse Emily. "Make sure this situation doesn't disrupt the rest of the ICU. And someone get me the..." Had an undeniable effect. Thomas's condition, which was once critical, is now showing signs of improvement that none of our treatments could achieve. As much as I'm a person of science, I can't deny the evidence in front of us. There's something remarkable happening here, and it's linked to Apollo's presence, though I can't explain how or why. The taller administrator turned his gaze back to Rose, who stood beside Apollo, her hand resting on his withers. Despite the mounting pressure from the hospital's safety protocols, she remained resolute, her voice calm but unwavering. "I understand your concerns about safety, but Apollo has been trained and is certified as a therapy horse. He's been a comfort and a source of healing for so many. This isn't just an ordinary visit. There's something at work here that we can't dismiss." The other administrator, the shorter man with round glasses, exchanged a glance with his colleague before speaking again. "We appreciate your dedication to your animal and your work, Miss O'Connell, but allowing an animal to remain in the ICU, even under these circumstances, is a risk that could set a precedent we're not prepared to handle." Rose's frustration bubbled up, but she remained composed. "What about the fact that Thomas, a baby who was on the brink of death, is now showing signs of life because of Apollo's presence? Are you really willing to ignore that?" The administrator's face remained neutral, but Rose could see the doubt flicker behind his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Harper cut him off. With a quiet sigh, Rose rested her head against the back of the bench, the weariness of the long night settling over her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, she was content to stay by Apollo's side, trusting that whatever had drawn him here, it was part of something far greater than she could understand. The moment was charged with a mix of emotions, joy, relief, and a sense of awe. The miracle that had unfolded over the past weeks had touched not only Thomas's family, but everyone who had been part of this incredible journey. Apollo, the horse who had walked into the hospital on a quiet evening and whose presence had altered the course of a life, stood as a symbol of the profound, mysterious ways healing can take place. As Thomas's parents made their way out of the hospital room, Sarah paused for a moment, looking at Apollo one last time. She placed a soft kiss on the horse's forehead, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us our miracle," she whispered, her eyes welling up with gratitude. The bond between the horse and the family had deepened in ways that words could hardly capture. Apollo, ever still and composed, seemed to acknowledge her gratitude with a gentle nod of his head, his calm eyes reflecting a wisdom that transcended understanding. Rose stood beside Apollo, her heart swelling with pride and a deep sense of connection to both the horse and the family. This journey had been one of unexpected twists and turns, but it had led to something extraordinary. Though this chapter of Apollo's story was coming to an end, Rose knew that his work wasn't finished. He had touched lives in ways no one could have predicted, and she had no doubt that his healing influence would continue to ripple out into the world. As the staff gathered in the hallway, their faces filled with admiration and disbelief, Rose felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. Apollo's presence had shifted the energy of the entire unit. Nurses who had witnessed the transformation couldn't explain it, but they had seen the results. The once critical baby was now thriving, and the entire atmosphere in the neonatal ICU had lightened, filled with hope and renewed belief in the power of the unexpected. When Thomas was finally wheeled out of the unit, his tiny form resting in his mother's arms, the staff clapped softly, a collective exhale of joy and relief. The once somber and sterile environment had been infused with a sense of wonder, and Apollo had been at the center of it all. Even the reporters who had gathered outside the hospital seemed to feel the weight of the story they were about to tell. It was no longer just the story of a sick baby. It was the story of a miracle, one that no one could fully explain, but one that had changed everything. As Sarah and Michael walked toward the hospital exit, their faces alight with the joy of a miracle realized, Rose stood quietly beside Apollo, her fingers still tangled in his mane. She looked at the horse, whose coat shimmered in the morning light, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Apollo had always been more than just a therapy horse to her. He had been a healer, a friend, and a guide. And now he had become something even more, an agent of transformation, a reminder that the impossible could sometimes become reality. As they stepped out of the hospital doors, the world outside seemed to pause for a moment. Reporters snapped their photos, eager to capture the moment. But for Rose, the most important thing was the unspoken bond between her, Apollo, and the family they had helped to heal. The story of this journey would live on in the hearts of all who had witnessed it. And though the hospital would eventually return to its usual rhythms, Rose knew that Apollo's gift would continue to touch lives, one miraculous moment at a time. Written together, she thought, a quiet certainty settling over her. Apollo had always been more than just a horse, and his journey was far from over. His gift of healing had touched Thomas, but it had also ignited something much larger, a ripple effect of hope and transformation that reached beyond what anyone had expected. As they stood together in the early morning light, Rose felt the weight of the decision she had just made, but it was a weight that carried purpose. Apollo had a gift, a quiet power that couldn't be ignored, and though he was aging, his mission was far from complete. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about the countless other people who could be touched by his presence, people who needed a reminder of the extraordinary possibilities that lay in the most unexpected places. She led Apollo across the familiar land of their stable, feeling the cool morning air against her face, the sound of his steady steps a comfort at her side. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew they would face it together as they always had. The world had seen Apollo's healing touch, and now the story would continue to unfold in ways